Oh my goodness, we're so fancy now. You see how fancy we are? Hi, everyone. My name is Tashmica Torok. I'm the founder and executive director of the Firecracker Foundation. This is our little live show called Spark Healing, where we delve into topics around healing. And right now, in the current climate of civil unrest around state sanctioned violence and police brutality, we are digging into conversations around abolition and defunding the police and what does that mean for our community and how do we have conversations around our questions, like what are our questions about that. So today I am here with Melina Brann, who is the executive director of the Greater Lansing Women's Center, or is it it's the Women's Center of Greater Lansing, yes?
Yeah. You got
it. Because I saw Melina posted a video over the weekend with some stats that I thought were really interesting, but also just because I respect her leadership. And while we're having these conversations, I want to be sure that we're lifting up voices of Black women in particular. As a survivor myself, I'll also be looking to boost the signal of other survivors and their experiences around the police. So, hi, Melina.
Hi, I'm so excited. Thanks for having me. I
Yeah,
feel like
I'm
a talk
excited.
show.
No, it does feel a little like a talk show. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the Women's Center?
Sure, yeah. So the Women's Center is a local community organization where we provide free and low-cost counseling, employment services, interview clothes, legal clinic, a bunch of things just to empower women, specifically women with low incomes, domestic violence survivors, sexual assault survivors, and women of color. So we've been around for about 15 years. We're right here on the east side of Lansing, and I took over about a year and a half ago. So I'm excited to kind of roll things out and include some racial justice stuff.
Yeah, and now is definitely the time to be having conversations around racial justice. And I have been saying a lot lately, not that it's new, but racial justice is survivor justice. And trying to encourage my community, both the community, like the greater community, but also our community of survivors and advocates and volunteers to really have some in-depth conversations about this topic. So, can you tell me a little bit about your perspective and some of the things that you shared on your own live video this past weekend?
Yeah. So I have gotten a lot of questions about what we can do and what allies can do. And a lot of people ask me about the 8 Can't Wait campaign, which is the campaign to ask for racial bias training, body cams, stuff like that, reforms that have proven ineffective in other police departments before this, such as Minneapolis actually tried a lot of these things, and this still happened with George Floyd. So, and I wanted to kind of explain that my views were to divest and defund from the police because we can better use those funds in other places, such as mental health, youth programs, community centers, things that actually invest in our people and our communities instead of investing in punishment and control. So I just wanted to kind of explain that to people in a brief video because I was tired of getting messages and answering the same thing over and over again. And I think getting that out there really helped because I haven't gotten a lot of questions.
Well, and I can say that I feel like I was this week doing a lot of research myself and doing a lot of reading and finding that I was also sending the same information out because this is all for some people it's very new. When did you first encounter ideas around defunding the police or abolishing the police?
It was about last year, if we recall, the teenager who was arrested by Lansing police and then beaten up essentially. That was around the time where I kind of realized that like we need to go farther than just reforms because clearly these aren't working. Um, and growing up half Black and in a household where both of my parents were police officers, this was an interesting perspective. And I really wanted to make sure that I understood it fully so I could explain it and defend myself. And so since then, I've been listening to podcasts, reading books. One of my favorite books, just a shout out, is The End of Policing. And that kind of really gave me a starting point to like really dig into what it means and what we should be investing in. And being a mental health professional, I was like, duh, prevention is better than punishment. So let's start from there.
Yeah, I was actually this weekend. No, nope, it was like yesterday, but who knows? Time is a lie. I don't remember when it was. Um, I was actually reminded, like I just had like this moment where I was like, oh, that's right. I had read this report about crime victim survivors and one report was from California, but we have another one from Michigan. And it actually says that survivors of multiple violent crimes, not just sexual violence, actually prefer, and of course, this is who responded to this report, but prefer rehabilitation and services over punishment. And as an organization that really, tries really hard to listen to survivors and to follow their leadership, that was a pretty interesting thing for me to read and sit with as a reminder that, some of this work is actually going to benefit survivors in providing them with more services for healing and also the other thing was more money for prevention. So can you share a little bit about, when you are talking about defunding the police, can you be a little bit more specific about why that appeals to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I think so police officers, especially patrol officers, aren't equipped to deal with a lot of the issues that they see when they come from calls. Like, they're not mental health professionals. I think I just read an article about a woman who had schizophrenia and bipolar, and her family called the police to help calm her down because she was being erratic, and they ended up um, killing her. They slammed her on the concrete, and then they handcuffed her, and it just went from there. And they are clearly not equipped to handle severe mental illness, let alone just regular things that happen in life that you are unequipped to handle, such as responding to trauma and that kind of stuff. And I also like firmly believe that when people get their needs met, they won't try to go to other things to meet those needs. Like, a lot of people, I know a lot of young kids when I was growing up, people of color, stole from the grocery store because their family didn't have enough, or like they stole like a watch because their family couldn't afford a watch and they didn't want to be bullied in schools and they wanted to fit in. So like once I heard about universal basic income, that was really a part that clicked for me too, because if everyone has enough money to meet their basic standard of living, and then they have a little bit more to like actually enjoy their life, crime is reduced. I think, I can't remember the city right now, but I was just listening to a podcast where they were instituting UBI on the city level, and the first outcomes were pretty positive. And I just think that if we can get prevention programs and social service programs that actually serve the people in the community and meet the needs of the people in the community, they're less likely to try other ways to meet their needs. And that's really what trauma is, right? It's you learned these other ways to get your needs met and to survive, and that sometimes rolls over into adulthood and unhealthy coping mechanisms. So if we can address those needs first before they get bad, then maybe our world will be a more positive way or place.
Right. And that is something that we've been doing a lot of reading about too. There's a documentary called Push Out that's talks about the school to prison pipeline, where that impacts Black girls in particular more than their counterparts, and how it pushes them into becoming criminalized and then into the criminal legal system. And so we have been doing research about the likelihood of that happening and how police and schools actually increases the likelihood of, oh, look, this is what happens when you give your kids your Facebook Messenger, y'all. Parenting during a pandemic. But, basically that it increases their likelihood of having a law enforcement referral just from having police in the school rather than having other types of professions in the school, like therapists or school support specialists?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just trying to look up. I wrote something down because I really wanted to say this, but I can't find it anyway. The black or control of Black Americans, specifically Black women, has been ingrained in the U.S. for years and years. It's in our fabric, and it just goes beyond physical things such as physical control. There's mental and emotional wounds that are persisting through over policing, especially in school, where Black students are more likely to get suspended or have out of school suspensions more than their white counterparts for nonviolent issues that could be solved by a counselor or a social worker in school. And I know from being a social worker, school social workers are very, we definitely don't have enough for them. It's usually, I think, one school social worker per district, and they have to go between all of the schools, and that's just not cutting it.
No, it's not. And I think that we sometimes forget that policing is a response to crime. It's not a preventative measure. It doesn't prevent, poverty. It doesn't prevent homelessness. It doesn't prevent sexual violence or child abuse. It is a response to those things. And one of the things that I've been really having conversations about is that child sexual abuse is also an epidemic, just like racism is, just like, well, we're in a pandemic. These are all health crises, and there are effective preventative measures, and none of them include law enforcement. People don't stop committing crimes just because law enforcement exists. And so when I think about children and I think about preventing child sexual abuse, I'm always encouraging people to move beyond looking for signs and start thinking about building safe and healthy relationships with adults who can become disclosure points for those kids. So kids can actually come to someone because they have a group of people, a group of adults who will listen to them, believe them, and then report that something is happening so that they can be so that there can be an intervention and that abuse can stop. But what we know is that 52% of the people that actually make those reports are school professionals. They're not law enforcement. And so when we think about defunding the police, we should be thinking about, okay, who are the people that are making the most reports of violence? Who are the people that need to be in those positions? And how do we move in that direction when we're talking about divesting funding and investing in prevention strategies that work for children, particularly kids of color and Black children?
Yeah, I agree. I have similar views for like domestic violence as well. A lot of women of color, particularly Black women, experience high death rate from domestic violence than their white counterparts. And when Black women turn to police for support, they're often they don't get safety and security. There have been multiple examples of women who have died from police coming in, and they thought that the woman was the aggressor and somehow shot them. There was also the woman from Lansing a few years ago. I can't remember her name right now. I'm so sorry that I'm forgetting it, but she worked at Joanne's and she had a PPO against her abusive ex-boyfriend, and he kept stalking her, and then he ended up shooting and killing her at her workplace because how else? There's no protection there. I mean, the only thing we can do is take preventative measures to make sure that people understand intimate partner violence, what the signs are, and kind of start talking to those people who are the abusers and finding coping mechanisms to make them not do that. I mean, I don't have the answers for that right now, but I know that hiring another police detective for domestic violence is probably not the answer. That was just a thing on Lansing City Council yesterday.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm really aware of is that trans women, in particular, trans women who are Black, also don't have representation in any of the domestic violence services that are happening in our community right now. And so, what would it look like if we defunded things that we don't need, over policing in communities that we don't need, and move it into strategically hiring people to provide domestic violence intervention, and those people actually match the lived experience of the people experiencing that harm. And so I think what people miss, especially people who are not necessarily in the domestic sexual violence field, is that survivors who are in the midst of violence happening don't necessarily want the person who's hurting them to go to prison, or to call the police on them. And so, in some ways, the way that we have set up our system is that you have to activate the police in order to get an advocate. In order to get to the help, you have to go through the police in so many different scenarios. And so, what I'm curious about is if we had people um, who are advocates, who are intervention specialists, who are Black people, Black trans people, what would be the likelihood that we would actually see an increase of disclosures and safety precautions and getting, and moving into safety if they had someone that was not someone who is likely to target them for violence, that they could go to first?
Yeah, and I actually just learned about a program called Cahoots. It's not in Michigan, but it's like you can call them for intervention instead of the police. So they have mental health workers, paramedics, and like other people who can respond instead of the police. And they get dispatched through the 911 dispatch before the police. And I think that would be a great starting point just to be able to have someone um, who doesn't have a history of excessive use of force and who is really there to help you because that's their job description and that's what they were trained to do. And I think that would be a great first step.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've also seen programs like that. I've also seen a lot of grassroots community-based organizations doing interventions that don't involve the police, that I've been really curious about how we could bring similar things to our community.
Yeah, I feel like that would take a good bit of staff and real organizing. I mean, I would be very interested in doing that and having people be able to respond. And we have the CARE program who sends advocates to sexual assault uh, survivors who recently just dealt with that. And I think the police respond as well, but that they have an advocate there to know what's going on and to empower them for that. So that is a great step in our community that I don't know if people utilize that as much either.
Yeah, we partner with the CARE program, and I really love the CARE program. But I do think that some of our programs are harm reduction, right? Like we know that we need advocates to be, and we're like getting as close as we can to being the first responders, in so many different scenarios. We're like trying so hard to provide that level of comfort and the mental health care and the support outside of the law enforcement pathway, and it's really difficult to find ways to do that, and to give people that have the skills they need to access survivors in that way the ability to do that without engaging with law enforcement every single time. And so I think that I've also seen, I don't know that I would call them like rehabilitation programs, but we have a program here in Lansing called Prevention and Treatment Services. And they actually work with people who perpetrate domestic violence to help support them through becoming people who don't cause harm in our community against women or anyone. And so I think that's another thing that a lot of people don't know is that people who are doing sexual violence and domestic violence harm don't necessarily go to jail and prison anyway, even after they're arrested. And so a lot of the fear around like what happens if we don't have a prison, it's like, well, perpetrators aren't going to prison anyway. So like, I understand that that's like, there's something there where you feel like that's like protecting our community from like rapists and murderers, but um, that's not the norm. Like the norm, and this, like working with survivors, the norm is not that they go to prison. And so if we know that to be true, then at this moment in history, when we are also watching state sanctioned violence just like over and over and over on a daily basis, we have an opportunity to take a breath and think about, okay, this system is actually something that we can transform and make better so that survivors can experience can actually experience like healing justice, like justice that focuses on healing for everyone involved. And what could that look like?
Yeah, I love that. I don't have anything as well put together as what you just said.
That's all I want, Melina. I just want justice that heals. Like that's all I'm thinking about all the time is like we have to figure out how to heal our community and we want to prevent violence, but unfortunately, that's not the role of the police. That's not what they do. They are responders. They are first responders. And I'm curious about what we can take from this moment and create. And I told my brother yesterday, I was like, the interesting thing to me is like people don't want to risk this. They're nervous about it, which I understand. And I also want to say that I just started learning about abolition and defunding the police and these community-based strategies maybe 2 years ago. So I'm still learning and practicing within my own community. So I don't want to be like, oh, I've always known this because I have not always known this. It has made me uncomfortable too. That is not the reality. But I feel like we have, oh, now I forgot what I was going to say. Is there any interest in having artistic outlet for survivors? Yeah, we actually do Soulfire. We do an art project every year, but art is incredibly helpful for some survivors. It can be really helpful towards their healing. I totally forgot what the hell I was going to say. Oh, that's what I was going to say. I was telling my brother last night that it doesn't take that long to become a cop in this community. What is it, like 20 weeks to go through the program, the academy? And I was like, we could just do it like Netflix, where we get like a 30-day free trial of defunding the police. Because it's not like we can't if this is a page that can be turned back automatically. Like if we infuse our community with money to address homelessness and poverty and social services for a year, and then we look back and we're like, oh, sorry, crime went up, then we could be like, it only takes 20 weeks to get like a whole new crop of cops. You know what I mean? It's possible. Okay, Tanisha from Voices of Color says, as a domestic violence advocate and survivor, my organization knows that police respond and are not proactive to preventing domestic violence. So can we talk about that a little bit? Like what are some things that do actually prevent violence, domestic violence and sexual violence in our community?
That's a great question. That is the question, right? So I know I mentioned it before, but definitely like education around what appropriate intimacy looks like and what intimate violence looks like, because it's not always physical abuse and that kind of stuff. There's economic abuse, there's emotional and mental abuse, there's manipulation, there's pushing your friends away so your abuser is the only one that they have. Like there's a lot of other ways that people experience abuse that I don't know if the regular community who hasn't experienced abuse really understand. We have that whole power and control wheel, and maybe if we can get that to teens who are like 13, 14, 15, just starting to have relationships, and have them understand like these things are not okay. And if you are experiencing these things, it's okay to tell someone, and then maybe justice can start from that young age and intervention can happen before they become full-fledged physical abuse or economic abuse and that kind of stuff.
Right, because violence escalates. We do know that. We do know that it starts with some smaller acts of violence that escalate into more harm if there is no intervention. And when I think about what you said in terms of giving youth the tools that they need, I also think about how adults need to be there ready to match them. So if you have a teen that's like, my partner person I'm seeing is doing this thing, threatening me with this thing that doesn't seem like a big deal to your parent, then you're teaching them that it's okay for their partner to treat them like that. And so we need adults to be aware of how to respond. We like to use the phrase disclosure ready. So like adults need to be prepared to recognize signs of violence and abuse and then respond by believing and then intervening on that youth's behalf. So Tanisha says, well, the Michigan Coalition is investing in green space for prevention and utilizing a lot of funding to do support that. Unfortunately, I need to see the research on that because I think the money could be better served for other prevention as education, et cetera. I'm not familiar with the green space either, Tanisha, but if you wanted to send a link, I could take a look and maybe we can comment on that later. Or we can just have a dialogue about it because I don't know. Um, I just I always think about how there's not much that's possible outside of relationship. And so I think that when we're talking about preventing violence, I think the reason why I'm so invested in community intervention is because violence can only really flourish in isolation. We know that. That's why people who are doing that harm isolate children, isolate their families when they're doing harm to them. And so if we as a community are more present in our communities and are more aware of what's going on around us and are prepared to intervene when harm happens, I think there's more possibility for prevention.
Absolutely. We've all heard that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. I think if we can get back to that, I'm a firm believer in like cooperative community living and knowing your neighbors. And additionally, knowing your neighbors helps decrease the, the amount that they might call the police on you if something happens. If you're able to just speak to your neighbor about issues that are happening, they're less likely to just automatically go to authority to help solve the problem. But yeah, having people in the community who are ready to listen and ready to act at a moment's notice, and knowing people in your community and knowing if there's something changing in them and their relationship is just a way to protect them and be like, hey, I've noticed that this is happening. Is this something you want to talk about? Is there something I can do for you? Can I take you somewhere? And just, like, do you feel safe? Just basic things could save someone's life, honestly.
Yeah, I feel like I want to encourage everyone to go and look at. You know what? I do not work directly with OK to Say. I am familiar with it, but I don't. I don't know if Melina does, but we don't work directly. I mean, we're a resource in the community, so anything that comes up from that can be referred to us, but we're not directly aligned with them. Um, One thing I was going to say is I would encourage people to go and look at the Audre Lorde project and the Safe Neighborhood. I think it's called the Safe Neighborhood Project or the Safe Neighborhood something. But essentially, it is a transformative justice response to creating community safety. And so instead of having neighborhood watches, you build relationship with the people in your community and you're checking on one another. And right now during the pandemic, that is what, when people are asking me about, we now have this, some people have a new awareness around the fact that people who are in their homes and have to stay in their homes are experiencing violence. But that was happening before the pandemic. It's just it's concentrated now because we're in this moment where we can't leave. And I've been expressing to people who are concerned that like going and meeting your neighbors from 6 feet apart and dropping things off and knowing where the kids are in your community and learning their names and learning about what their life is like is a prevention measure. I know adult survivors now who talk about neighbors knocking on their door and the neighbors didn't know that violence was happening. They didn't always know, and sometimes they did, right? Something, and they didn't have the skills to respond, but they did intervene and they could interrupt the violence. And that was something that was kind of a saving grace for the youth. And so it's like even just building a safe and healthy relationship with someone who is a young person is a prevention strategy.
Yeah, and having healthy adults they can look up to, who are mirroring healthy coping mechanisms, healthy relationships, healthy eating, even can really impact a young person's life if they have a model of what they can be or what they should be, they can make changes by themselves. They are just little people. They have the same brains as we do. They're just not fully they don't have the same experiences as us. But when they have someone who can share past experiences and what they've done to get through things, that can be really helpful.
Post links to both of our organizations. Oh, sorry, I don't know. Maybe I was muted for half of that. We will post links to both of our organizations. We definitely need all of the fundraising dollars that we can get during this time period, especially with the pandemic. Oh, look at that. Paul's behind the scenes, just making our lives easier. So please visit the websites and check out what we're doing in the community. We are both working really hard to make sure that our community is not just safe, but also has access to healing as the priority. So please check us out. We will be around. I wanted to also say that I wrote a toolkit that I'm about to publish on our website for childcare collectives, anticipating that people are going to be needing childcare, because we just saw a story released, an article that without a federal bailout, we don't really know what school looks like in the fall. And so a childcare collective is when adults come together and care for the children in their community. And so that could be like within your family, that could be with non-parenting people in your community, or like us, it might be me and my staff trying to figure out how we get work done at the office, and sharing responsibility with our family members. But I'm going to be putting that on our website because that is a prevention strategy. The more healthy and safe adults that children have in their lives, the safer they are, and the more likely they are to come forward if something harmful is happening to them. Oh, thanks, Kristen. So, Melina, just to go back, because we've talked about prevention, I'm out here telling people about the child care collectives. Woo woo, Nora, yay. Trust me, I have been writing it and tweaking it for weeks because I knew that we were going to need a different strategy for caring for our children during this time period. And so I will definitely be putting that up on our website very soon. And maybe we'll do a conversation about it with someone who's done a child care collective before. I don't know, anything's possible. But I did want to go back to you because the whole reason I wanted to have you on here was because you shared this really impactful statistic. And before we end, I wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to share that and we could talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, so the statistic that I shared was 14% of Michigan residents identify as Black, and Black Michiganders make up about 34% of all arrests in a year. And so this is really disproportionate. And on top of that, women of color represent 38% of US women, and they represent 64% of women in jails across the US. So yeah, I kind of just wanted to talk about how the Black community is over-policed while under-policed at the same time. So we are over-policed for small things, such as like loitering or possession of marijuana, for instance, while we are under-policed for things like sexual assault and murder and that kind of stuff. There was a young Black man, I forgot I'm terrible at remembering names, so I'm so sorry if their family is listening. But he was out with his friends. This was here in Lansing. They went out for a night of partying, and then they found his body in the Grand River the next day, and I believe that case is still unsolved. So there is just example after example of over-policing while under-policing, and I wanted to get your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, no, I feel like based on the research that we are seeing, there's a couple different things, right? Like I've already lifted up in this conversation that we tend to, when people are saying we need the police, they're talking about sexual violence and domestic violence, or violent crimes in general, child abuse crimes, is lifted up as the reason why we need more police. But the police actually, did I break up a little bit? Anyway. But the policing that's being done is not responsive or preventing those issues. The policing that's being done is actually smaller things, as you mentioned, things that we're already decriminalizing also. So like not just selling and distribution of marijuana, but sex work, prostitution is over policed. There's like all of these things that citing at people for random things that don't need to be addressed. So there's a lot of over policing in that way. And we know based on statistics that Black girls in particular are 6 times more likely to experience sexual violence. And I believe Indigenous girls have a higher rate than that. And then trans girls have an even higher rate than that, right? Like, so we know in the spectrum of who's experiencing violence, Black, Indigenous, trans youth are kind of the people. And if they also have a disability, we know that they are in the crosshairs of intersectionality. We know that they are the ones who are multiply marginalized and experiencing violence, but we also know they are the least likely to report because they do not have good experiences with law enforcement and or are criminalized and or unfortunately are experiencing sexual violence or excessive force from police. So we've created a system that is only accessible to cisgender white people. And that means that people with disabilities, that means that our Indigenous people, that means trans people, LGBTQ people, gender nonconforming, do not have they do not have access to this criminal justice system, which is why I always call it, from my friend Sujata, and there are many other people who say this, is the criminal legal system, because we're not getting justice. We are not getting justice. We are not even getting our needs met for healing, and we're not getting our needs met in terms of responding to the violence that we're experiencing in an equitable way. And we're being pushed into, the school to prison pipeline, and we know that survivors of violence are also criminalized for protecting themselves. So there's like a whole other piece where we know there's an organization called Survived and Punished. Y'all should go check them out, because they have a lot of information about how survivors are often criminalized for defending their own lives during a violent situation. So there's like all of these pieces that we know are not working. And I've been wrestling with this for the past 24 hours. I don't know why this has been so present with me. And I wonder, Melina, if you've been feeling this too, but I've just been sitting with how much white people are willing to sacrifice my people for their sense of safety. And it makes me incredibly sad, because I'm like, we are sacrificial lambs, not for your actual literal safety, but for the concept of safety that you've built up in your mind that actually doesn't even exist based on the research that we have.
Yeah, I've been feeling a lot of like white people making me feel like my existence is uncomfortable to them, and my right to live and to prosper and to enjoy life is uncomfortable to them. And I mean, even Eric Gardner, who died at the hands of NYPD police, he was in the neighborhood that was gentrified, and it showed that that neighborhood had an increasing level of low-level complaints and offenses, such as like loitering and possession of minuscule amount of drugs and that kind of stuff, because white people were coming into this neighborhood and feeling uncomfortable with the culture that was already there, trying to insert their own culture, which necessarily didn't fit who was still living there. Yeah, and that has been heavy on my mind, especially with all of the new developments happening in Lansing. Like, is that going to happen to us? Is this going to be a thing? And it could be. It honestly could be. And I think we need to make some changes now to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Absolutely. And so let me just say, for all of you here and for those of you at the back, please stop calling the police on Black people for shit that is not necessary. Please don't do that anymore. Unless you are experiencing violence or harm, you need to stop calling the police, because they are not your personal protection. They have a very specific use within our community. And honestly, I think it's actually really disrespectful to law enforcement to be calling them for stuff that they don't need to be responding to during a global pandemic. So there's multiple layers to why that's not necessary. So let me just say that. And also, yeah, there is this sense that Black people don't belong anywhere. We don't belong in our communities, they're over policed. We don't belong in gentrified communities that are actually our communities that you've decided are cool now and you can have. And we don't belong in white communities. So like, where exactly can Black people live? and prosper and expect healing and justice? Where is that space in the world?
Yeah, it's apparently nowhere. And I posted this on Facebook yesterday. Police in the South started as slave catchers and slave controllers. Police in the West started as rangers to keep Native people out of their colonized spot. And so this institution of policing has always been a form of control and containment, especially for people who are seen as others of the ruling body, which happens to be cis, straight, white men. And it just doesn't, that culture and of the institution is still there today, exhibited by a multitude of things that we have talked about. But like, if we don't feel safe, and we as women of color, people of color, all of these things, if we don't feel safe, then what is the point? Because we are part of the people too, and you can't just represent one section of the population.
But we are also targeted by violence, not just domestic and sexual violence, but white supremacy. So zipper van, white people accepting Blacks way for their privilege with regards to the coronavirus pandemic. Absolutely. Yeah, that's also a thing. Black people are also in the crosshairs of this pandemic because we have a health system that is rooted in white supremacy. But we have
Oh no.
Are you trying to shut me down? We know that Black and brown people over the long term are not getting equitable services in healing spaces, equal industrial complex, which is not necessarily a healing space for all people either. So that is why this conversation is not just about, it's not just about police, so about sexual violence. It's also about homelessness. It's also about, it's all, like all of these things are tied together and all of them have a negative impact on Black people. And white people are very willing to sacrifice us for their sense of safety because they don't have to address these problems because they don't impact them.
Yeah. I missed half of what you said because you were frozen, but I'm sure I agree with it. And I just wanted to add, Black people are on the front lines of the coronavirus pandemic, not only because we're not being treated at the same rate, but also after 400 years of oppression, we are still low-wage workers. We're still working at grocery stores, working at things that are deemed essential. And so it's just another way of putting our lives on the line and for comfort of other people, of privileged people who can work from home.
Yeah, and I also want to start having, I think I'm going to have a couple people join on this conversation who are disability justice activists too, because the other thing I think that is a problem with some of the reforms that are being recommended is that they are not accessible to people with disabilities. And so if we're all not safe, like you said, what's the point? Like if the point is for all of us to have safety, then we really need to be dismantling a system that is making us less safe and propping up the work that is actually creating safety and healing and responses to violence. So yeah, there's a lot, we got a lot of work to do. So I was curious, what is on, we're gonna end, it's almost been, well, it's been about 45 minutes and we were gonna end at like 11:45, but I told Paul we would end when I want to, which is on brand, incredibly on brand for me. But I'm curious, what's on your mug, Melina? I wanna see your mug.
Oh, it says whatever is meant to be will be. I love puns and gardening. So
Oh, me too. And I have, I accidentally planted, no, let me take that back. I intentionally planted mint next to my strawberries, but I wasn't aware that that was a mistake. And so my entire life has been about mint being pulled out of my garden. It's very mint to me, and my strawberry bed right now is like I have so much mint. Every year I have to clean it out like 2 or 3 times a year. So if you ever need mint, I'm your girl. I got it. And then this I think this is going to be a thing. So whoever comes on, they're going to have to put their. So this is mine, feisty and non-compliant, from the Michigan Disability Rights Coalition. I love mugs, but anyway, I'm always like, what's on your mug? Let me see.
I love it. Oh no, you're frozen again.
So great Lansing, right? Oh, can you see me yet? Am I doing it? How about now? Okay. What can people do right now?
Let's see. Well, they can support organizations who are working for racial justice and who are supporting our community, such as the Firecracker Foundation, Women's Center. But also, I really want people to listen to Black leaders in their community and Black-led organizations, because I feel like those voices are being overshadowed a little bit. And I just want to make sure that we're propping them up because our community is being affected the most right now. And so I think we have a pretty good handle on what we want out of this.
Yeah, no abolitionist theory is a Black feminist theory that's been around since the 1970s, and that the public is just now coming into awareness, to me is an actual reflection of two things. Number one, that the function of white supremacy is that Black people don't know themselves, their history, or what liberation looks like. That's a function of white supremacy. And then the Black women and leaders. Because if we would have listened, then the law enforcement that exists today would that it does. Because have been saying that it is harmful, probably longer. So I think that that's also a thing that we need to, I agree, we need to amplify and read and learn. May, I think. I don't know what the situation is in terms of like what the buildup to the budget proposal in May, or these ideas have these with our so that we can actually make an informed choice around how law enforcement is able to move through our community, what they're able to be looks like, and what services we can invest in. Should we make the choice to defund portion of law enforcement impact? That's all I want.
Pretty simple. And you did break up for a lot of that. I think we got most of it. You must have terrible.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to figure out the internet situation that's going on at my house. I guess so. Should I not say? Don't call Lightspeed, y'all. Don't be mad at them. Something's going on. It might be because I'm silenced by the internet. Right, whatever. I'll talk about it next time on our YouTube channel. Is it still breaking up, or am I actually being heard right now? I don't know. So whatever you missed, hopefully it'll be on the YouTube channel later, fully captioned and all of that. So thank you, Ellen, for joining us. Thank you, Melina, for taking time out of your day to come and sit with me. We'll have to do this again because I don't know if we're actually, I'm just sitting here now. Paul, tell us if we're done. Are people watching us awkwardly sit here right now? Maybe